Okay. Welcome everyone. We are live on YouTube and our live stream is up and running for all of our attendees as well. I am going to do the briefest of introductions for the folks who might be their first time. At the bottom of your screen, you can see a Q&A button. If you have a question for the presenters, you can pop that button up. Hold on, apparently we have a technical difficulty. Some of our presenters can't hear me. Just gonna do a functionality check real quick. Chairman, I'm gonna allow you to talk. Can you hear me? Chairman Stanek, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Molly, loud and clear.
Okay, then Patrick and I will sort that out while Ray presents. There is a Q&A button at the bottom. There's also an option for attendees to raise their hands. We will save questions for the end, but feel free to put them into the Q&A box at any point in time. I or one of the other panelists may be able to answer it without interrupting the presentation, and then hand raising when we're done. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Ray Byrne with Sandia, and he's going to take us through the presentation. And I'm going to sort out on the back end whatever's going on with Patrick's audio. All right, Ray, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Molly. So my name is Ray Byrne. I'm manager of the Electric Power Systems Research Department at Sandia Labs, and I also lead the energy storage analytics work at Sandia. And first, I just like to acknowledge our funding source. All the work that we talk about in these presentations is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Electricity Energy Storage Program, which is led by Dr. Emra Juk. Looks like I can't switch slides. There we go. Okay. So energy storage applications, there are many of them. There are lots of different ways to categorize or slice and dice applications. One common way is to break them up into energy and power applications. Energy applications are often slower time scales, like hours to days, and often involve large amounts of energy. Power applications are more.
The number of kids we have right now is 277.
Should we mute that person or ask them to mute?
I'd say 285, something like that.
Okay, sorry about the interruption. Power applications, they occur at faster time scales, milliseconds to seconds, and they're often associated with real-time control of the electric power grid. Some examples of energy applications are arbitrage, renewable energy time shift, demand charge reduction, time of use charge reduction, transmission and distribution upgrade deferral, and then grid resiliency. And then another example of an energy application is some form of capacity payment. And we normally, I don't spend much time talking about capacity payments, but since that was a requested topic, I'll just give a little bit of background. So originally, the motivation for capacity payments was to provide funds to build large investments in like coal plants or nuclear plants that were dispatchable generation. But with the introduction of renewable generation that's more variable and energy storage, there have been a lot of changes to the way that capacity markets operate and who gets reimbursed for providing capacity. There are a lot of different ways to define the value of capacity. Sometimes what people do is talk about, you know, what the value of the peak hour of the year is when you have your peak demand. And that's when you need that last extra megawatt hour of energy. And that's the value for capacity. In a lot of markets and regions, they tend to have different definitions, like how you get remunerated for providing capacity. Oftentimes, you know, you have to meet a time requirement, like being able to provide power for 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, to be able to provide capacity. But in the end, it really, from a storage perspective, it gets down to what your definition of capacity is, and then whether your particular storage device can meet those requirements. It's really more of a philosophical discussion whether storage should even be a capacity resource, or wind or solar should even be a capacity resource, just because it gets back to what the original intent of what capacity is defined as and what it is. So I hope that kind of explains a little bit about capacity. And I think Patrick will talk a little more about it, but from a valuation perspective, from the storage owner's side, it comes down to whether you meet the requirements as defined for participating in capacity, and then what the remuneration scheme is. And as far as power applications, you have frequency regulation, voltage support, small signal stability, frequency droop, synthetic inertia, and then renewable capacity firming. So in the rest of the presentation, we'll go through each of these different benefits and then talk more about them, and then also talk about combining benefits for value stacking. So energy arbitrage is probably the most common energy storage benefit that people are most familiar with. It's really simple. Just buy when prices are low and then sell the energy when prices are high. In order for this to work, you have to have peaks in your prices and valleys. The two plots at the bottom of the slide just show some typical pricing behavior. Most of the time you have a peak in late afternoon, early evening when your peak load is. Some systems, depending on the configuration, you often will have a peak in the morning as well, and people first get up and turn on the lights and cook breakfast. But one thing that people don't often understand is that there are losses associated with storage. So just because you have a price difference between one time of the day and another time of the day, that does not necessarily mean that you have a viable arbitrage opportunity. So you have to take into account losses. So if you have an 85% round trip efficiency, you need about 117% price difference before it even breaks even. Similarly, if you have a 65% round trip efficiency, you need to have about 154% price difference. So the price difference has to be quite great before you actually start making a significant amount of money on arbitrage. In market areas, you're participating in the market, and your potential revenue is governed by market prices. In the vertically integrated utility, arbitrage really comes down to more efficient operation of your grid. If you can flatten out your effective load curve, so that you can operate generators more efficiently, or maybe at better operating set points, you save money that way. For most of the work we've done, if you're a vertically integrated utility, the efficiency savings from arbitrage usually only amount to a couple % of your total operating cost. And then in market areas, you can make money with arbitrage, but it's rarely the highest revenue stream, especially compared to frequency regulation. You can also have different variants of arbitrage. Instead of buying and selling in a market, you can charge from solar or wind and then sell into a market. You can also arbitrage between a day ahead and a real-time market, or participate just in the day ahead market. Oftentimes prices in real-time markets are much more volatile, so there is a much more of an opportunity for arbitrage. But it does get to be a forecasting challenge if you're playing both the day ahead and real-time markets, because oftentimes you'll have to decide when you're going to buy and sell well in advance of the actual market clearing times. So this is an example of looking at California, looking at energy arbitrage in their day ahead market, where we modeled a 1 megawatt 4-hour system with 80% efficiency. And we looked at about 2,000 pricing nodes from 2014 to 2016. And if you look at the total revenue in these charts, it's really not that much. So on the left is just day ahead market arbitrage. The best nodes are the red ones, and you're looking at maybe $150,000 over 3 years. Considering a 1 megawatt 4-hour system will cost you a couple $1 million, it doesn't even begin to make sense. But if you look at the chart on the right, where you look at day ahead plus real-time arbitrage, then there's a lot more opportunity. So then you're looking at maybe $500,000 total revenue for the 3 years for some of the red dots. So that's starting to get a little better. But this analysis assumes perfect foresight, which is the best you can do. That means you know the future. But when you start to arbitrage the day ahead in real-time markets, it gets complicated from a forecasting perspective. Let's say you want to buy in the day ahead market and then sell in the real-time market. You have to predict the price a day in advance for the real-time market fairly accurately in order for that scheme to work. We've looked at some relatively simple trading algorithms that maybe use the day ahead market price as a proxy for the forecast of the real-time market price the next day. And you can do fairly well, but you're still not getting anywhere near 100% of your maximum potential revenue. It's on the order of maybe 50 or 60% with a relatively simplistic algorithm, which is still much better than just day ahead arbitrage. But if you want to do day ahead and real-time arbitrage, there's a lot of effort that needs to go into your forecasting algorithms. The next application is renewable energy time shift. So here the goal is to shift renewable generation from off-peak to on-peak hours. So a good example of this is the CAISO duck curve. In California, because of all the rooftop solar deployments, in the middle of the day, the net load drops significantly. And then as the solar starts tailing off in the afternoon and people come home from work and turn on the lights and cook dinner, there's this really quick ramp required to meet load. So in a market area like CAISO, they've got a ramping product that you can try and use to deploy storage and participate in that market to help with this. In other areas, arbitrage is really your only option. And then if you're a vertically integrated utility, it's more of a reliability question. You know, how do you reliably track that large ramp in required generation and do it reliably and at lowest cost? So I added this slide in because we meet with a lot of public utility commissions, and we oftentimes get the impression that people think that the combination of Tesla Powerwalls and PV on residential housing is going to let people go 100% renewable generation. So I guess right now the grid does have a fair amount of pumped hydro, and by power rating, it's around 95 or 96% of the storage deployed on the grid. But these sites are fairly large. So the picture on the bottom left is of Raccoon Mountain pumped hydro, which is in Tennessee. It's 1.6 gigawatts for 22 hours. And so if you were to try to implement an energy storage system with batteries, you would need about 20 billion 18650 cells that would go 3 times the distance to the moon. So as we have states starting to have mandates or goals of 100% renewable generation, we are going to require massive amounts of longer term storage. There's a trade-off between the amount of storage, additional transmission, because geographic diversity reduces variability, and then renewable curtailment. So at some point, it might be more feasible to operate the grid and just dump power from wind or solar than it would be to build more storage. But in any event, long-term storage is going to be an issue at some point. There are a couple mature technologies. Pumped hydro has been around for a long time. Compressed air energy storage. There's one in Alabama that's been operating since the 70s. Thermal storage, concentrated solar. There are a couple facilities that are operating in the US now. They can easily store the molten salt for weeks at a time, some over a month. There are some promising long-term storage technologies like flow batteries and hydrogen electrolysis, but much more research is still needed on long-term storage options. So I guess the point of these 2 slides is, you know, it's probably not going to be just Tesla Powerwalls and rooftop solar. We are going to have to look at other different technologies to meet our goals of 100% renewable generation. Time of use charge reduction is a behind the meter application, and it's really just arbitrage based on the rate structure. So you have a rate for each time period, or it can be on peak, off peak pricing. Some locations, they actually have like 15-minute pricing for residential customers and industrial customers. Like arbitrage, it's often not a significant benefit. And one of the reasons for this is like, let's say you have a 4-hour battery, it takes 5 hours to charge it. If you do one arbitrage cycle per day, you're only using the system for about 9 hours, and it sits idle the rest of the time. So, you know, the potential revenue from the price differential is often not that great. And then often you're not utilizing the system very often either. Demand charge reduction, it's often a behind the meter application, but it can also be a front of the meter application. A lot of ISOs base some of their payments for transmission and capacity markets based on an effective demand charge. But the idea here is that, you know, you have to pay a rate that's based on your maximum consumption over some billing period. And so if you have narrow spikes, that can significantly increase your electricity bill. And this often results in a significant benefit, especially for industrial customers that have peaky loads that involve like pumping or other things where you have large startup currents. Transmission and distribution upgrade deferral. So the idea here is you have some projected load growth that requires a transmission or distribution upgrade, whether it's replacing a transmission line or upgrading a transformer. If you can deploy storage, you can defer the investment. And so here, the key is deferring a really large investment for a long amount of time or maximum amount of time with a very small storage is kind of the sweet spot. So you might have a scenario where you have a transmission line that's only overloaded, maybe, you know, a few hours a year, and then you have really slow projected load growth. So with a relatively small storage system, you could defer an investment a couple of years. And because the transmission investment was a large investment, you can actually have a very large savings. One of the problems with this benefit, it's often very lucrative, but it's highly location specific. You have to deploy storage in the exact right point in the grid where you have this problem. And so it requires a lot of knowledge about your grid. And then another question it brings up is oftentimes, you know, you only use the storage device for a couple hours a year to get this, harvest this benefit. What do you do with it the rest of the time? So that was one of the reasons people started looking at value stacking is, you know, I've got assets sitting there and I'm only using it a couple hours a year. What else can I do with it? That can be good to use the storage for other applications, but also you have to keep in mind that oftentimes those other applications might not provide as much value. And if you degrade the battery system and reduce the lifetime, it actually might not make sense to use it for other applications when all factors are considered. Grid resiliency is a really popular topic. Events like Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina have increased the interest in this. Value in grid resilience can be a challenge. Typically people use value of lost load. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab has some reports in an online calculator where they're estimated based on market prices and surveys. We did a project with Sterling, Massachusetts, which I'll talk more about in a subsequent slide, where their whole goal was to put in a system to provide power to their police and fire departments in case of winter storms or hurricanes. And so in that situation, you had the potential to save a life because the police and fire folks could be dispatched when they normally couldn't in an outage. But if you look at the value of lost load tables, you know, public administration was the closest category we could find, and that really probably underestimates the value because it doesn't take into account that you might be saving a life if you're enabling a first responder. Associated with grid resiliency is basically backup power and microgrids. And so all a microgrid is a concept where you have combinations of different types of generation and load that can operate independently from the grid if needed. Energy storage is a key component. You're often paired with distributed generation like solar, wind, diesel, or natural gas. And microgrids are a whole topic unto themselves, but the design and operation comes down to an optimization problem. When you're designing your microgrid, there are trade-offs between the size of the storage versus the size of the other grid assets. And then also when you're operating the system, you want to operate it for maximum efficiency. So both those come down to optimization problems. If you're another concept with microgrids is if you're a microgrid person, usually you're focused on the resilience benefit, and then they're hoping that the blue sky benefits or the benefits from operating just day in and day out help pay for the microgrid. My background is more from energy storage valuation. So, looking at the blue sky operation of the system. And then I was always hoping that the resilience benefit would pay for the system. But most situations, if you want a microgrid for resilient backup power, it does cost more because basically you're replicating some of the capabilities of the grid. So a common misconception that we've also seen is that people think microgrids are going to lower their energy cost. That's only true if you have really high energy costs, like in Hawaii, or if your energy is really unreliable. But in general, you are actually paying for the more resilient power in one way or another. Frequency regulation is the second-by-second adjustment in output power to maintain grid frequency. In most areas, you have an automatic generation control signal that is sent to all the resources providing frequency regulation, and then they follow that signal. The picture on the right is an example of the PJM Reg D signal, which was designed for fast resources. And you can see over the course of an hour that the signal goes through zero a number of times. The characteristics of that signal can vary from ISO to ISO. In California, the signal's a little slower. Implementation also varies by independent system operator. In some regions, like PJM, it's a bidirectional signal. So if you sign up to provide frequency regulation, you have to both charge and discharge power. In other areas like CAISO and ERCOT, there's a separate regulation up and regulation down signal. So if you wanted to, you could charge your battery system all the way to full state of charge, and then just provide regulation in one direction and keep discharging until you reach a level where you want to charge back up again. So having the split markets does offer some additional operational modes. Pay for performance has been around for a couple of years now. Most remuneration schemes involve a performance score. So that's how well did you track the command signal. And then there's also a mileage payment. So the more movement you have in the signal, the more you get paid. And this is good for storage because the rationale is slower responding resources won't be able to move as quickly, and therefore their performance score won't be as good. And then also their mileage payment will be less because they didn't move as quickly and as much. Frequency regulation is often the highest potential revenue stream in most of the market areas that we've looked at. These are just some results from PJM in 2014 and 2015, where we modeled the Beacon flywheel system, which is a 20 megawatt, 5 megawatt hour system. And if you look at the potential revenue, it's pretty significant. It's about $6 million for this 12-month period. The actual system only cost about $20 million. And then Beacon went through a reorganization, and it was bought for pennies on the dollar. So the company that bought Beacon is probably doing fairly well. But one comment about frequency regulation markets is they're usually relatively small with respect to the size of the energy market. So usually it's only like maybe 1 to 3% the size of the energy market. So because it's small, it is more sensitive to having new people come into the market, which reduces the prices. And we have seen this in PJM. So there was a large opportunity for providing frequency regulation. So there were more entrants into the market. And every year for the last 4 or 5 years, the opportunity has decreased. Because it's a small, frequency regulation is a small market, it doesn't take much for folks to move in and impact market prices. So voltage support is another application. This is where you inject real reactive power to control voltage. The good news for storage is you can support reactive power over a wide range of stated charge. It's really limited by the inverter ratings. Some independent system operators compensate for reactive power at the transmission level. Oftentimes, most voltage problems are in the distribution level, and there's really no mechanism to compensate folks in most places. Because other assets can also do this, pretty much any inverter-based generation can provide reactive power. So that includes solar panels, and then the competition, if you were to use a traditional resource to provide reactive power, you would install a capacitor bank. Since the other options for reactive power are relatively low cost and there's a fair amount of competition, in the end, the value of voltage support is probably going to be relatively low compared to other value streams. Small signal stability. So in all large power systems, you have low frequency oscillations in the 0.2 to 1 hertz range. These are just a natural phenomenon caused by the structure of the power system. And it's just electromechanical oscillations between the large generating units separated by long distances. The reason people are worried about small signal stability is the 1996 West Coast blackout in Washington, Oregon, and California was partially attributed to undamped inter-area oscillations. You can improve these oscillations by injecting real power at different points in the grid. The map on the right shows one of these typical modes. So this is a north-south B mode in the Western US. So you have the blue dots are basically oscillating against the red parts of the system. Sandia had a project with Bonneville Power Administration where we demonstrated modulating a HVDC link that runs up the west coast of the US to improve small signal stability. It is a potential future revenue stream for energy storage, but at this point, it's probably 10, 20 years out. Frequency droop is another application for energy storage. So frequency droop just refers to generator speed control that's proportional to the speed or frequency error. So traditional generation can provide this. Energy storage can provide it with a control law. The reason this is important is if you have a large loss of generation and you have a drop in frequency, how low your frequency nadir and how quickly you start recovering is influenced by how much frequency responsive generation you have. In the eastern United States, there's a lazy L. So when you have an event where you lose a large generator, you have your frequency drop and you hit your nadir. And then the frequency tends to just kind of bounce around for a while, causing the L-shaped response, and then slowly comes back. In the Western US, you get more response like shown in this image here. So in the US, generators were not required to provide frequency responsive service, nor are they compensated for providing it. FERC started looking into it back in 2016. By 2018, they issued FERC Order 842 that mandated that all new generation must be capable of providing frequency response as a condition of interconnection. So they basically modified the small and large generator interconnection agreements. So now every grid asset that connects to the grid has to be able to provide this. There's still a question about how you get compensated to provide this. So people have to do it, but compensation is still a question. Related to frequency droop is synthetic inertia. So right now, large rotating machines provide inertia. And so when you have a drop of a large generator, the rate of change of frequency is a function of how much inertia you have in the system. So if you have a lot of inertia, the frequency will drop relatively slowly. That's a good thing. That usually means the frequency nadir is higher. It also gives you more time to respond. If you have less inertia, that rate of change is much faster, and then your frequency nadir is usually lower. That can often lead to under-frequency load shedding and cascading outages and other bad things. So as we increase the amount of inverter-based generation on the grid, that displaces traditional generation and its inertia. Energy storage and other inverter-based assets can provide synthetic inertia via control law. Right now, there's no mechanism for compensating resources that provide inertia. One research area that we're starting to look at is how do you actually measure grid frequency when there's a disturbance. So you need the inertia usually when you have some kind of fault or disturbance. But when you have that type of a fault, you often have distorted waveforms. So how do you differentiate a signal that doesn't really look like a sinusoid to figure out what the change in frequency is to implement your control law? So we have some research projects looking at that now. There's also some advantages to responding to a system frequency or an average of the frequencies throughout the grid. So this is a simulation of the Western US power grid, looking at the speed of different generators. And you'll notice that they all kind of oscillate around system frequency. And that's basically the inter-area oscillations are what you're seeing. And so if you take all these different speed measurements or frequency measurements throughout the grid, and then take a system average and respond to that, it actually smooths out the response and can be very effective. The downside to this is that you have to have more communications. Renewable capacity firming. So this is just the second by second adjustment of output power for smoothing renewable generation. This is pretty common in Puerto Rico and Hawaii. And usually it's a penalty avoidance maneuver. Both Puerto Rico and Hawaii have penalties on renewable generation if their output varies too quickly. And so the implementation is relatively straightforward. You just have to design some kind of filter which makes sure that you always meet whatever the spec is for maximum rate of change. And then you find out the difference between that and what the output of your renewable generation is. And then you send that command signal to your energy storage to smooth out the renewable generation. So we've talked a lot about, all these potential benefits from energy storage. The next step really is how do you maximize revenue from energy storage? And so you formulate it as an optimization problem. It's a linear programming optimization. The first step we usually take is look at the best possible scenario, which is perfect foresight. So that gives you insight into storage operation. And then it also is a starting point for developing operating strategies that don't require perfect foresight. And then another advantage of using perfect foresight is if you have a system that's deployed in the field and you have some kind of algorithm that controls the system and you run it for a while and you want to see how well it's doing relative to how they could have done, it's always good to compare to the best possible scenario. As I mentioned before, in most market areas, frequency regulation is the optimum application. And so if you run an optimization, it'll basically tell you to do frequency regulation all the time. In some ways, that's nice because you don't have to have any forecasting. You just do frequency regulation all the time. An exception is ISO New England. They have a mechanism for paying into the forward capacity market that is based on your peak coincident load hour for the year. And then they have a mechanism for paying for the transmission in and out of ISO New England, which they call the regional network service payment, which is based on your monthly peak coincident load. If you can knock down your load during those peak hours, you can save a significant amount of money. And the savings are on the order of par for frequency regulation. So in that particular market, there are actually multiple benefits where if you stack them, it really helps because they're all roughly the same order of magnitude. Grid resilience is a common goal, but some of the challenges there are value of lost load numbers from surveys don't yield significant value often. And then it likely does not capture the value of first responders. Lawrence Berkeley is in the process of adding some new categories that will maybe capture the value to first responders. And then finally, the definition of resilience is important. And if you're trying to be resilient to something is coming, like a hurricane or a winter storm, where maybe you get a week's notice, your life is much easier because you know it's coming. You can charge your system up and be sitting there at 100% state of charge. So when that event does happen, you're ready and provide resilient power for a week or two or whatever was required. If your definition of resilience is being resilient to a random event that you have no idea when it's going to happen, whether it be like a terrorist attack or a cyber attack or something like that, or an earthquake, then it becomes a little more challenging because then you need the required energy stored in your system basically at all times because you don't know when the event is going to happen. And this makes penciling out the investment a little harder because you often have to store a lot of energy at all times, and you can't use it for other things because you're saving it up for when this event's going to happen that you don't know will happen. So it makes the economics a little more challenging to come up with a scenario where it makes sense, unless you can put a high value on whatever you're trying to be resilient with respect to. For most of our modeling, where we're trying to look at revenue, we use a relatively simple energy flow model, where the state of charge at the current time step is the state of charge at the previous time step times some storage efficiency that basically accounts for parasitic losses over each time period. Oftentimes we set that to 100% and just ignore it. An exception would be maybe for flywheels where you actually have quite a bit of losses each time period. And then you have a quantity of energy purchased for recharging and then a quantity of energy sold for discharging. We often use a model that just has a single round trip efficiency number. You can also, in reality, the real system has losses on the way in and losses on the way out. So you can assign the losses differently. In reality, both models are fully equivalent. One of the nice characteristics of this model is your state of charge is your useful state of charge that you have available because you account for the losses on charging. Then you've got some constraints, the maximum energy that can be charged or discharged in a time period, which is a function of the power rating of the system. And then you've got a minimum and maximum state of charge. And then we define some kind of objective function. This example is for the day ahead and real-time market. You have prices associated with each market activity. And then an important aspect of this is you also technically have costs associated with charging and discharging. A battery storage system or other types of storage technologies usually have a finite life. How you operate the system can impact the life of the system. You can model it as just having a total throughput for a system, and then each time you charge and discharge, you're using that throughput, and at some point you're gonna have to replace the system. But that's still a pretty open area of research. There are different degradation models out there, but that's something people often don't consider is how the operation of their system for different grid services can impact the degradation. A way around this is if your warranty is pretty flexible and just guarantees the system will operate for 10 years, then you really don't have to worry about degradation. It's covered by the warranty. But more often than not, warranties can be fairly restrictive and end up resulting like in additional constraints to your model because you can only operate it for so many charge discharge cycles per year and other constraints like that. And we've already looked at this plot, so we'll skip this one. So this chart shows the frequency regulation opportunity in CAISO. So if we go back, the chart on the bottom left, we saw this before, but this was day ahead arbitrage revenue. 150K was the maximum revenue for some of the best nodes in the system. If you start including frequency regulation, you'll notice the numbers are a lot better. And so here we've got pretty much the whole region of Southern California as around 310K per the 3-year period. That's significantly better than just doing arbitrage, which was consistent with what we see in most markets. Another interesting observation from this plot is because frequency regulation prices are also zonal in many ISOs, it improves or limits the impact of location on value. So in this case, as long as you're in the southern pricing zone in CAISO, where the prices are much better. There's more opportunity. Whereas if you're just doing arbitrage, you're truly just tied to the LMP pricing for that one particular node. But in this case, you have flexibility to be anywhere in the southern region. ERCOT at one point just had one price for all of ERCOT. And so in that case, for regulation, it didn't matter where you were in the system. So this slide talks a little bit more detail about the Sterling Municipal Light Department example. Their primary motivation was resilience, but resilience really didn't amount to much as far as a potential benefit. So we looked at other ways to pay for the system. So we considered energy arbitrage, reduction in the RNS payment, reduction in the forward capacity market payment, grid resilience and frequency regulation. So if you look at the table, modeling a 1 hour, 1 megawatt system, about 16% of the revenue would come from arbitrage, or about $40,000. Reducing your monthly peaks could save you about $100,000 per year. And then reducing that 1 hourly peak for the forward capacity market would result in about 45% of your total revenue, or $115,000. So it's good that you can have a large savings from reducing that forward capacity market obligation. The challenge is if you don't hit that 1 peak hour, you're basically losing 45% of your potential revenue. So it does increase the challenges associated with forecasting. Interestingly, Sterling, their forecasting method for the first few years of operation was reading the paper every morning, having a cup of coffee, looking at the weather, and then just deciding what time to charge or discharge. And they actually hit every peak except for one for the first couple of years, including the monthly and annual peak. They've since turned it over to a forecasting company. But if you can have this potential revenue, but when it's defined by hitting hourly peaks, you really have to make sure you hit the hourly peaks, or you quickly won't realize the potential revenue. So this is just the optimization results over a typical week for the Sterling system. And the optimal policy is doing frequency regulation all the time. So in this case, QReg is the amount that you provide to the regulation market. So you hang out at a 50% stated charge. And then right before you have to hit the hourly peaks, you charge up to 100% stated charge, and then do the 2 hourly peaks. And this is just a zoom in of the one day that has the 2 peaks. So for this particular day of the year, the monthly peak hour happened to be right next to the annual peak hour. So you discharge for those 2 hours, harvest the benefit from those two, and then would go back to doing frequency regulation all the time. If you don't hit your peaks, you don't get that revenue. So like I said, it introduces a forecasting challenge, and it can make stacking benefits a little difficult. As far as valuing storage in a vertically integrated utility, production cost modeling is typically the gold standard when you're doing integrated resource planning or looking at savings from energy storage. And all production cost modeling is an optimization that looks at how you dispatch your various resources to meet load. And you have to have an accurate transmission system model to account for congestion. You need to model load variability. You also have to do a good job modeling renewable variability. And then you have to have generator models. This primarily addresses arbitrage and then reserve products like spinning reserve or non-spinning reserve. But it can be a complicated process to pull all this data together. Other benefits require technical analysis and then comparative economic analysis. So if you're looking at primary frequency response and inertia, you have to do dynamic simulations. If you're doing voltage support, you have to do power flow simulations. In distribution networks, you have to do solar hosting capacity analysis to see when you're going to start to have problems with certain levels of renewable generation. And then transmission and distribution deferral, you have to do load modeling and some power flow modeling usually. So it's really pretty complicated if you're a vertically integrated utility to make the case for valuing energy storage. So as far as stacking benefits, you can stack benefits to increase potential revenue. but it is at the expense of potentially accelerated degradation of the energy storage system. And then you also have the added complexity of forecasting and controlling the system. If you're trying to do 5 different grid applications that require very accurate forecasting for each of them, it can quickly become a mess, and you start missing in your forecast, and then charging and discharging at the wrong time, and you'll quickly not be harvesting much of your maximum potential revenue. And then there's also modeling degradation as a function of the charge discharge profile. So maybe frequency regulation, the battery will last 7 years, where if you do something else, like hitting the monthly peaks, it'll last 10 years. Trying to model that is still an active area of research, and that's something that most folks aren't considering yet in their economic analysis. So in summary, storage is capable of providing a wide array of grid services. The regulatory structure is still evolving for many of these applications. Sometimes there really aren't mechanisms for being compensated yet. And then there are also different technologies for energy versus power applications. Although lithium ion is often deployed for many applications today, there are a wide range of technologies that have different strengths and weaknesses. So depending on what your application is, you do have to consider the different potential technology options. And then valuation of storage is highly location specific. So this is a combination of effects from having locational marginal prices, as well as the varied regulatory structure scattered throughout the US. You can have the same exact energy storage system located in one place and have it not be worth very much, and just move it 100 miles down the road, and there can be significant benefits just because the difference in the regulatory structure. So for further reading, I'd encourage you to go to Sandia's website, which is the DOE Energy Storage Program website. It has all the papers from Sandia and Pacific Northwest National Labs, proceedings from all the conferences that DOE puts on, as well as just a wealth of information on energy storage. So with that, thank you for your time, and we can turn it over to questions.
All right, this is Molly. So we've had a number of questions from a number of sources. As a threshold issue, would you mind doing a rundown very quickly of which of these benefits would be under the jurisdiction of the Maryland Commission in a restructured state?
I might refer to Will if he's on the line for that one. I'm not sure I can answer that one.
Yes, hello everyone. This is Will McNamara with Sandia National Labs. And it's a very good question. It's an evolving state of affairs under regulatory jurisdiction. To suffice, make it as simple as possible, benefits that would be tied to the distribution grid would potentially fall under the jurisdiction of the Regulatory Commission. Now, in Maryland, as a restructured state, also a state that is looking at potential ownership issues with the T&D utilities, it's very likely that if ultimately a regulated T&D utility in Maryland has ownership rights for storage, if that is the decision that's made, then the commission could get involved in evaluating and potentially putting a price on benefits that are tied to the distribution grid. Now, once we start talking about market participation or benefits that speak to the transmission grid, then we start getting into FERC jurisdiction. So I think the simplest way to think about it is benefits that are tied to the distribution grid would potentially fall under the jurisdiction of the PSC.
Thank you. So the next question we have came from Commissioner Richard, and this was early on in the presentation, but it says, why is clean hydrogen considered long-term? Aren't there some nuclear plants considering hydrogen production during off-peak times?
So hydrogen's considered long-term just because the idea is you can store vast quantities of it in big tanks. So, you could conceivably also maybe store it like an underground geologic structure. So it's kind of akin to compressed air energy storage. There are also other schemes out there for like chemical processes, like creating ammonia and then using that at a later time. And because it's basically a chemical process, you can scale it up. And so people typically consider hydrogen a potential longer term storage mechanism.
And Ray, this is from me, just for my benefit. What is generally considered the line between short-term and long-term storage?
There is no clear line, but when I'm thinking long term, I'm thinking days to weeks to months.
Okay.
And then people often will throw out the term seasonal storage, and then you're talking like winter to summer. You know, yeah, so there's no clear cut dividing line.
Fair enough. And then Ray, can you pop up the Q&A window? There's 2 questions from Chuck Brody, and I was wondering if you could read those out and maybe address them.
Okay, do you have any information regarding presence of third-party aggregators enabling smaller entrant participation and their performance market share and the various regulation markets or other value stack components? So I have not worked with a lot of third-party aggregators. There's a company in Massachusetts called GenBright that we've worked with that's an aggregator there. So we could put you in contact with them if you'd kind of like to talk to them about their business model. But I don't know how prevalent aggregators are. Patrick, do you want to maybe chime in on that?
Hey everyone, this is Patrick Balducci from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. They're quite prevalent across the country. I know there are several operating in California, Massachusetts, CPower, Internoc, integrated microgrid systems. Is that what it's called? I'll have to think a minute to remember one, but there are several aggregators you can follow up with. In terms of their performance, it's not clear to me how well they perform. From the perspective of the meter customer, it makes something that, for the most part, is infeasible, which is participation in feasible, because it can be aggregated. You can get around thresholds that would limit your participation. But then the aggregators tend to take 30 to 40% of the profits for the specific items that they're bidding you into the market to obtain. And so there are trade-offs, but effectively it's something that's otherwise feasible from the perspective of a behind the meter customer. And there are several across the country that are performing this role.
Yeah, and then there's also another trade-off too, as to whether like your goals for your storage system align with the aggregator. So if you have a reason where you need to use energy storage, like the specific to your plant or other industrial process, and then the aggregator wants to participate in some markets, maybe do frequency regulation, trying to work out so that you still have access to it when you need it, and they use it the rest of the time can be a challenge too, depending on what the scenario is.
Yeah, which means you have to carefully work through your participation agreement. So,
yeah.
So that you can ensure if you're using it for resiliency purposes, that it's going to be there when you need it. So it's something you have to work through with the aggregator.
Yeah. In the simplest scenario, if you just have storage and you're basically just turning it over to the aggregator to pay for it and trying to hope to get the most you can from them, then it'll work out fine. But it's when you have other reasons why you want storage that maybe are different than the aggregator, then it can get complicated very quickly. All right, so have you seen integrated deployments of mixed systems, chemistries to optimize for conflicting revenue mechanisms? So there are some examples of like actually lithium ion paired with like, natural gas generation. GE has a commercial product. I guess this was maybe a little more popular 4 or 5 years ago, this concept. But part of the problem is energy storage is that lithium is pretty flexible, and it also happens to be pretty much the lowest cost technology right now. So most of the systems now are usually just lithium ion based. Patrick, do you want to comment on that one too?
Yeah, I haven't studied that much. It certainly is an area of interest, and we've received some calls from utilities to study this a bit more. And in fact, we submitted a grant application with Orcas Power and Light Co-op to the Washington Clean Energy Fund, and we received an award. And so we're going to be studying that process of using competing technologies to satisfy different grid requirements to take advantage of the benefits of flow versus lithium-ion battery systems. But the systems haven't been deployed yet. So we'll have something to report probably in about a year or two.
Yeah, and like I said, about 4 or 5 years ago, before lithium really broke out, there was a diversity of different technologies with different strengths and weaknesses. So this was a little more popular of a concept back then, but just because of cost reasons, a lot of people just have been gravitating to lithium ion now.
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective of Opalco, the utility we'll be working with, flow batteries are potentially a workhorse in the sense that you can cycle them quite frequently without much or any degradation, and they can have a very long economic life of 13 to 20 years. Whereas if you're using lithium ion for that purpose, you would, reduce its economic life to well under 10 years potentially. But lithium ion battery systems are more cost effective. They're cheaper, and they operate at a higher efficiency rate, and it's a more mature technology, so you're more sure of what you're going to get. And working with some flow battery manufacturers, some haven't delivered their products, and one of the companies that delivered their product, it ultimately failed in the first couple of years. And so there's more certainty, more mature technology with lithium ion and a higher performance, but there are limitations in terms of cycling.
Okay, next question. We've been pondering ways to provide coordinated control over LFP and flow or other chemistries. We considered combination with the generation technology like CHP to be a different animal. Who controls? Let's see. Oh, that's a response. Oh, never mind.
So I think that's all the questions we have in the Q&A. If anybody on attending has any other questions, they want to raise their hand. Otherwise, we're going to take about a 7-minute break, and we will start the second presentation at 1:20. We're doing our best to get back on schedule. I do apologize for the delay. The commission's 10 a.m. meeting went a little bit longer than expected. So with that said, I'm going to pause the recording. I'm going to mute everybody, and we will be back at 1:20 for Patrick's presentation. All right, thanks, everyone.
Hi, Molly. Would you like me to bring up my presentation and just get it loaded?
That'd be great.
Okay, great. So then let me make sure I can do this here. Do that, and then I'm going to share screen.
We do have a question from Commissioner O'Donnell on the phone, so we will address that as soon as we come back at 1:20.
Okay. Tell me if you can see it.
I can see your screen.
Great. Okay.
Looks like you're good to go.
Okay. Then let me see if you can see me too here in a minute.
Looks good.
Looks good?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I'm going to stop the video and mute for a moment, and then I'll be right back.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Okay, great.
We're going to start again in about 1 more minute for everybody.
Okay. So you can see me, but can everybody else see me now as well, or?
Yes, everybody can see you and hear both of us.
Okay. I reminded my daughter one last time to not barge in on me. She told me, I know, Dad, you've told me like 4 times. And it's probably about 50-50. She'll come in at some point.
I organized my entire week for my mother to have my children for these 2 hours every week.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to start the recording.
Okay.
All right, we are back recording. Commissioner O'Donnell's hand was not a question. He was just letting us know he had to pop off. So I don't see any other hands, any other questions, any other comments. So with that, Patrick Balducci with Pacific Northwest National Lab, I'll let you take it away.
Great. Can you hear me, Molly?
I can.
Everyone can hear me. Everyone can see me. Got the virtual background. I'm ready to go. So I'm Patrick Balducci. I'm Chief Economist at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I am also the head of our energy storage analytics team. So I'm Ray's counterpart at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I lead a terrific group of physicists, engineers of many stripes, and economists. And some of the names of the team members are listed on this first slide. I wanted to give them credit for all of their exceptional assistance. And let's see here. Oh, okay, great. All right, it's live now. So here's my first slide here. For those of you who called into this is slide 2. And this shows you some of our ongoing demonstration projects that we are completing at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. You can see that we're evaluating 1.6 gigawatts, 18.2 gigawatt hours of energy storage at 16 sites across the US. It includes lithium-ion and flow battery systems, small and large scale pump storage hydro systems, power to gas system in Massachusetts, and a comprehensive model for a power to gas, hydrogen-based, and fuel cell system that I think we're going to hypothetically locate in California, but it'll be a model that utilities can use and use other users, developers, to model the effects of energy incentives, clean energy incentives, changes in price, changes in costs, and how those can affect the economic return on hydrogen-based systems. You know, we're evaluating everything from lithium-ion based systems in the San Juan Islands to small modular pump storage hydro in Puerto Rico, all the way up to Massachusetts with several systems there, including a hydrogen-based power to gas system and a microgrid in Northampton, Massachusetts, and then also a lithium-ion battery system on Nantucket Island. So we're evaluating storage systems across the country. When we're evaluating storage systems, the 4 types of assessments that we're performing are economic assessments, distribution system impact assessments and integration work, control system development, and performance testing and characterization. As it relates to the economics of energy storage, we've segmented the benefits into 5 categories, and you can see those categories presented here: bulk energy, including capacity or resource adequacy and energy arbitrage; the ancillary services that are traded in markets, but even outside of markets, we model those in terms of avoided costs, using production cost models, typically; transmission services, including transmission upgrade deferral and transmission congestion relief; distribution system services, including upgrade deferral, volt-var control, conservation voltage reduction or CVR; and behind the meter customer energy management solutions, including time of use charge reduction, reliability improvements, and demand charge reduction. So we began this process by conducting an extensive literature review, and we conducted a meta-analysis. And so what we took is, you know, these 40 to 50 energy storage studies conducted across the United States. And you can see that we normalize the results of each based on $1 per kilowatt per year. And that's based on the power capacity of the energy storage system, which means that if it's a 1 megawatt system, you would take any of those values and multiply it by 1,000. So you can see, for example, capacity tends to be in the $80 to $130 per kilowatt per year range, although it varies from one location to the next fairly significantly, of course. So that'd be $80,000 to $130,000 per year in terms of capacity value, provided that the utility isn't resource long, which it is at times. But if it requires capacity, it tends to be in the $80 to $130 per kilowatt per year range. And I'll give you the basis of that in a few moments. Arbitrage tends to be a much lower value system. Regulation, the more significant value stream. When you move over to transmission and distribution deferral, what you'll see is that it tends to be a lower value stream, but locationally speaking, it can be quite significant. So for example, transmission upgrade deferral value on Nantucket Island that we recently evaluated was enormous. It was over $100 million in present value terms for deferring an investment in a transmission, submarine transmission cable by roughly 13 years. Same thing with distribution upgrade deferrals. In many cases, the value is nil or zero. But in a few locations, it can be quite significant. If you can defer an investment in a distribution substation, for example. I'll get to that in more detail in a few moments as well. And you can see the behind the meter values varying quite significantly from one location to the next. And demand charge reduction tends to be a much higher value than time of use energy charge reduction. Okay, we're moving on to slide 5 here. So capacity markets have been established in several regions throughout the United States, and there has been some volatility in these markets. So today, the markets are yielding fairly low values in Massachusetts and California, in the $2 to $4 per kilowatt per month. But a few years ago in ISO New England, the capacity market was yielding much higher values in excess of $10 per kilowatt per month. But as Ray mentioned in his discussion of frequency regulation, as prices top out at high levels, we all remember the laws of supply and demand. And if you shift the supply curve outward as new entrants into the market expand the supply, then it drives down the price. So assuming that demand remains relatively static, as more entrants into the marketplace shift the supply curve outward, there's a new point of equilibrium that would be at a higher Q, a higher quantity, but a much lower price. Effectively, they drive down the price. So energy storage systems can sometimes be a victim of their own success here in terms of their effectiveness in providing capacity and, of course, frequency regulation. And it's important to account for that because if you're bidding into a market expecting the current market rates, remember the system may last for 10 to 20 years. Those rates may not be realized in years 3 and 4 and all the other out years. In terms of assigning value, it tends to be measured in terms of the cost of a new entrant or the next best alternative asset for providing that resource adequacy or capacity benefit. But then you have to back out the flexibility benefits associated with these assets because they can do more than just capacity. And you also have to account for the incremental capacity equivalent of energy storage. So a 2-hour energy storage system will not provide as robust a capacity resource as would a peaking combustion turbine, which is not energy limited. And so you have to complete a loss of load probability analysis and define an incremental capacity equivalent, which may only be 50 to 60% of that peaking combustion turbine. And so while the cost of that peaking combustion turbine may be $150 to $200 per kilowatt per year, that's how you get down to $80 to $130 per kilowatt per year. And in fact, for lesser systems with energy to power ratios of 1 or 2, it could be half of that much. Okay, on to slide 6, frequency regulation. This is the second by second adjustment in output power to maintain grid frequency. So following that 4-second AGC signal, There are three components to it: a capacity payment, so how much you bid into the market; a service payment, mileage or service, that is the summation of all those green bars there. So effectively, you're paid for the energy flowing into and out of the energy storage system. Think of it as a string that is going up and down throughout the hour, and then you pull it taut, and that value is compensated. And then finally, there's a performance component as well. So if you're performing at 95%, and there's a complex algorithm for defining your performance score, but the ISO market will monitor your performance. And if you obtain, let's say, 95% performance, then your payment would be multiplied by 0.95, or there's a 5% degradation of the performance and the score. And so therefore the value that you receive. Energy storage systems perform exceptionally well, better than most any other unit that will be providing frequency regulation. But once again, this is a shallow market. So when market prices are high, new entrants can quickly crash the market, as happened in the case of PJM. Transmission and distribution deferral. Ray covered this fairly well, but here's the basic and very simple calculation. Sometimes the load analysis can be complex, like the one we performed for Nantucket Island. We were looking at hourly load and forecasting out for several years. And accounting for the uncertainty with respect to that load can be challenging, but in a very simplistic term, as you can see here, if you can defer an investment in a distribution substation for 6 years, you can see the cost of that substation increasing by 3%, but when you use the weighted cost of capital in the denominator as the discount rate, you can see that it reduces the cost in present value terms by 25%. And this is how you account for this in utility accounting or economics. And the rationale being that money is worth less in the future because you could otherwise use it to reduce your debt or invest it or because of inflation reasons. And so accountants and economists account for this and other factors, including risk and uncertainty associated with the future, to discount future values. And so this is an appropriate way to account for this, and this is how it is effectively done with utility economics. Outage mitigation. We will simulate the with and without energy storage system scenario within our simulations. And what we'll do is we'll define a statistically average outage year based on multiple years of outage statistics for the area of the distribution system that we're islanding, or if it's behind the meter for the specific user. We rely on interruption cost study statistics that are published by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And we can assume multiple scenarios on either perfect foreknowledge or no foreknowledge whatsoever, and then basically define the value of energy storage on site for reducing the probability of an outage, and then the value of that to the customers that are affected. And it tends to be segmented based on either residential or small CNI and large commercial industrial. And the breaking point there is 50,000 annual kilowatt hours of consumption. Now, if you evaluate each of these use cases individually and then sum them all together, you're likely to overestimate value by, somewhere between 20%. So a co-optimization process is necessary. So we have a tool called the Battery Storage Evaluation Tool. And effectively, we're defining a duty schedule for the next 24 hours, and then that is updated on an hourly basis. And so you can see here in the first panel on the left-hand side, energy prices. And then if you're providing arbitrage only for this 5 megawatt here, you can see it charging up in the early hours and discharging around lunch and in the early evening hours. When you add in balancing or frequency regulation, then there is a deviation from that arbitrage signal to take advantage of the higher values associated with regulation. And then in the third or the fourth panel, we layer in T&D deferral opportunities, and then last panel is the all-in, including volt-var control. And so as you layer in one benefit stream after another, it deviates from that first panel there that's providing arbitrage only, and then is a much more complex system. Now you're getting almost no value associated with arbitrage because you've deviated from that to take advantage of the higher value applications. So this really is necessary to take advantage of multiple use cases and estimate their value realistically, because after all, there's a multi-dimensional co-optimization procedure required. Avoid the double counting. If you use energy in 1 hour, there's less of it available in the next. And if you're providing service for one, if you're providing energy for one service, you may or may not have any energy available for the other services simultaneous. And so you effectively have to account for that in the modeling process. So here is one example project here, the Salem Smart Power Center. This was a 5 megawatt, 1.25 megawatt hour lithium ion battery system built and managed by Portland General Electric. They initially received significant funding under ARRA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. We modeled 9 value streams, but a smaller number than that generated positive economic value after the co-optimization procedure was completed. You would be correct in noting that it is a shallow energy storage system here with an energy to power ratio of 0.25, which means if you provide full power output for 15 minutes, you would deplete the energy in the battery system. And that has significant implications for the economics of the system. So a note on the optimal scaling of the Salem Power system here. First of all, when we evaluated the values individually, you can see them stacked there. We estimated value at about $7.5 million in present value terms. Now that's technically unachievable. When we co-optimize, we can see that the values are reduced by about 25% or a bit more, I think, down to $5.8 million. So co-optimization was essential here. We also found that the cost of the system as built several years ago, about 7 or 8 years ago, was much higher than would be experienced today. So the costs were in excess of $20 million. So the value of the system fell far short of the 20 million plus that was spent on the system. But we found that if built today, the costs would be closer to $7 to $8 million. The other thing that we found out is that at an energy to power ratio of 0.25, the return on investment ratio is negative. And in fact, quite negative using those old prices that were in place when the system was originally designed and built. But today's prices, the system could pencil out, particularly if you manipulated the energy to power ratio. So today we found that the correct energy to power ratio would be around 2. So 0.25, you yield a negative return on investment. And with a properly scaled system with an energy to power ratio of 2, then you could potentially result in economic returns, a positive benefit of 1.24. So for every dollar invested in the system, you could yield $1.24 in return. So performing these sorts of design studies before you actually design and purchase and deploy the system is important. Another system that we recently evaluated was the Nantucket Island energy storage system. It's a very unique system. Because Nantucket Island is located approximately 30 miles off mainland Massachusetts, a small resident population of 11,000 households throughout the year. But the capacity constraints exist in the summer when the population swells to over 50,000. As tourists descend on the island, the system becomes constrained. So Nantucket Island's electricity is supplied by 2 submarine cables with a capacity of 71 megawatts and some on-island combustion turbine generators with a combined capacity of 6 megawatts. So they were bumping up against the capacity for their electrical grid. but only for a small number of hours every year. And so rather than investing in a $150 to $200 million submarine cable that would have to wrap around the island and then connect on Bunker Road substation there, the decision was made to invest in a 6 megawatt, 48 megawatt hour Tesla lithium ion battery storage system and a large combustion turbine generator with a temperature dependent maximum capacity of 16 megawatts. Now, National Grid understood the value of the transmission deferral value stream, but didn't understand the other local benefits, including CVR and volt-var optimization and outage mitigation, and then market operations, including the forward capacity market, arbitrage regulation, and spinning reserves. So I'm on slide 13 now, and the benefits of local operations are quite significant, enough to pay for the system. Just those benefit streams alone yield a return on investment ratio of 1.3. That's because deferring investment in transmission cable generates $110 million in benefits because you defer the investment for 13 years, and in the denominator is a weighted cost of capital of 6.5%. Also, we found that over an 11 there were over 700 outages on Nantucket Island. Excuse me. And what we were able to do is actually model the distribution grid. You can see that there highlighted in your image to the lower left on your screen. And we were able to actually simulate those outages and determine the ones that the energy storage system and CTG could be used to reduce the customer minutes of interruption. And with some investments in reconducting and automated feeder switching, we found that during that time, the energy storage system plus the CTG could have eliminated up to 46% of the customer minutes of interruption. So a fairly significant benefit stream there, which we valued using the value of lost load statistics from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Benefits of market operations, we can see the continuous storage facility system, which asset class, which has now been defined in ISO New England. So this is a partial response to FERC Order 841. And so what it effectively does, it allows you to answer the question of, is energy storage a generator? Is it a demand side resource? Is it a regulating resource? And the answer in New England now is yes to all three questions. So effectively you can bid into multiple markets simultaneously in a single hour and receive a combined signal. So you can see the blue line there in the upper right, that's a regulating resource signal. You can see the gold, which is effectively providing energy resources as a generator would. And then the red is showing a demand side resource when you're charging up the energy storage system. And effectively all three are combined into that very looking signal on the lower right, and you're compensated for participation in markets intra-hour. The other thing we did that was very on the regulation side is we didn't assume perfect performance, and we also didn't assume perfect foresight with respect to market prices on the energy and the frequency regulation side. So what we did was we used something called, we used a statistical analytical technique called the gradient boosting machine method to predict prices. We also overlaid that what was called an ARIMA forecasting method that took into account forecast of weather and temperatures for the next day. And so we didn't assume perfect foresight. We were bidding into the market based on imperfect foresight and then clearing based on actual historic prices. And it did have a significant impact on the profitability. But still, we found that you could generate, in present value terms, about additional almost $20 million in benefits over the next 20 years. So, or 24 million, excuse me, over the life of the battery storage system. When all of those streams are combined, you can see the estimate of $146 million of benefits over the economic life of the system, 94 million in costs, including the full rate impact. So we included debt and insurance and all the O&M costs, all the energy costs. So return on ratio 0.55 with benefits. The frequency regulation participation is easily the most significant driver of value, the most frequent use of the system. So to account for degradation, we do have a health model now. So we can build the degradation effects into our procedures and solve so as to maximize the value of the system subject to the constraint of degradation. But in this case, what we did is we didn't have any real understanding of the degradation for the Tesla lithium-ion battery storage system. So what we did is we operated within the constraints of the warranty, which limited our number of cycles every year, and the throughput, which I think was about 7,200 megawatt hours of energy, as I recall. So it was about 150 cycles of the full range of the 48 megawatt hour energy storage system throughout the year. Here's a third study that we completed for the Joint Forces Training Base Los Alamitos. This is a microgrid, and we placed photovoltaics, diesel gensets, and energy storage behind the meter for this, or at least simulated the operation of these assets for the customer. And what we're able to do, and from this we developed a tool. We were able to define resiliency goals. So if your goal is to meet, let's say, a 90% probability of surviving up to a 2-week outage, then what we could do is explore trade-offs between investments in PV, energy storage, and these diesel gensets. So rather than focusing on the least cost alternative for meeting these goals, what we could do is focus on and define the lowest net cost of the system. So it included all the revenue that could be generated from the photovoltaics and the energy storage system. And what that means is, diesel generators are going to be less costly in nearly all cases for meeting the resiliency goals of a system relative to PV and energy storage. But energy storage and PV or solar can generate benefits. And so you can net out those benefits from the cost of the systems. And so that's what our system, that's what our microgrid system can do, our model can do. And so you can see here that the optimization resulted in a sizing of system assets of 1.2 megawatts for the gensets, 1.2 megawatts for the photovoltaics, and a 408 kilowatt, 510 kilowatt hour energy storage system for this space. And so that was a very interesting result, and it created the basis of our model that we use in this space. So here are the results of some other recent studies. PSE Glacier, it's being used to island a remote community near the Canadian border. And while the economic returns are still negative, you can see fairly significant benefits. That light blue segment of the bar is showing the benefits to the local community. Opalco Decatur Island, that was very interesting because we built a model that could estimate an electrothermal model that estimated the value of using the energy storage system to reduce voltage and stress placed on the submarine transmission cable, and how that translated into an extension of its economic life. Avista Turner was very interesting from the perspective of the utility. It was a very poor economic return. I think it was around 0.23. So for every dollar invested, they would only yield about 23 cents in return. But to the customer where the system is located, it could generate enormous benefits. At Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories, they experienced voltage sags throughout the year, and the ability of the energy storage system to detect those voltage sags and address them before their machine shut off generates a benefit that's measured at about $150,000 per hour of downtime that's avoided. And every time the machine shut off, it takes them at least 3 hours to come back online. So each year, the energy storage system could help SEL avoid, basically a $450,000 to $500,000 cost. So an enormous benefit there. A couple notes on energy prices. Energy prices are indeed falling, but when you hear these these cost estimates of $150 to $300 per kilowatt hour of energy content, know that you're really just discussing the battery cells in the pack, but it doesn't include balance of plant, it doesn't include power conversion systems, and it won't include all construction and commissioning costs as well. When you include those, the cost of the system roughly doubles, and those costs aren't declining as rapidly as they are for the battery systems themselves because those costs are more mature. So here's a shout out to one of our recent studies. You can see the citation there to the lower right, Mongard et al., this energy storage technology and cost report. We estimated the performance of 6 battery systems and 4 non-battery energy storage systems. And we split it out into those 4 components: capital costs, which is really the pack and cells, power conversion system, balance of plant, and construction and commissioning. And we show it in dollars per kilowatt for those components that are driven by power, and dollars per kilowatt hour for those that are driven by energy content. And so for any system, you could develop a cost per kilowatt or cost per kilowatt hour applied to those different components. And you can see here that the costs for lithium ion are currently really the lowest, and the performance is the best among the energy storage systems that we compared it against. We also forecast those out to 2025, and you can see several performance characterizations as there. Here's the summary of the pumped hydro, and I will note that when estimating the value or the cost dollars per kilowatt hour basis, you can see that this is lower than any energy storage system. But large pump storage hydro is being built today because the costs are enormous. The systems are typically enormous as well. So these can be in multiple gigawatt hours of energy, and also multiple billions of dollars in terms of the costs. Okay. Some important notes about performance. So we've been conducting extensive battery testing at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I'm on slide 21, by the way. So what we do is we begin with the DOE OE energy storage protocol, and then we develop these use case-based duty cycles. So we take our battery storage evaluation tool, and what we do is we create a duty cycle that mirrors what a battery system would be doing if it was providing, let's say, arbitrage for this energy storage system at this location, or frequency regulation by this energy storage system at this location for this utility. And then we run the battery system through those real world sort of economic operation focused duty cycles, then back through the DOE OE test protocol, back through some use case tests, and then back through the OE test protocol a third time. And so we generate our very realistic round trip efficiency rates, response rates, ramp rates, and all those other metrics that are listed there, and several others as well. So something I want to point out here is that you may hear from a manufacturer in industry literature that lithium-ion batteries can achieve a 90% plus round-trip efficiency, or flow batteries can achieve 80% plus. In many cases, those are DC to DC, so they don't include the impact of the power conversion system and other auxiliary loads that would be used in the field. And it doesn't include temperature effects because the testing is conducted in a laboratory. Once you include those, the round-trip efficiencies begin to fall. And of course, they vary based on how you're using the system and what your chemistry type is as well. So we can see here when we tested these battery systems at a low, a moderate, and a high rate, that the round-trip efficiencies for the lithium-ion battery systems deviated from a low of 69% all the way up to 90%. When you're excluding auxiliary power. When you include auxiliary power, they dive down to, that's where you get to the 69 to the high 80s. But including the auxiliary power. Well, I think I stated this wrong. When you include the auxiliary power in the calculation, then it's going to be 69 to the high 80s, and that's the appropriate metric. Without auxiliary power, it tends to be higher in the 80s to low 90s. Flow batteries tend to be a bit lower in the 60s and 70s for the most part in terms of their round trip efficiency, which means every time you charge and discharge them, you're losing 30 to 40% of your energy. You can see here, even for a single lithium-ion battery system, that the round trip efficiency can change quite significantly. So each of those boxes is effectively 1 week of testing for a specific use case. The blue boxes are the baseline tests, for the most part, that were conducted using the DOE OE test protocol. And then when we engage in economic operation, which really can be imperfect duty cycles in terms of capturing a high performance rate, you can see the round trip efficiency begin to fall there. And it's also highly dependent on the temperature effects for this lithium-ion battery system. Now, this looks like as the temperatures increase, it only goes up. That is true up to a point. And this system was in a cold climate near the Canadian border. If it had been in the southeastern United States, what you would see is effectively it would peak. And then when you get in the high 80s and 90s and above 100 degrees, that the round trip efficiencies would begin to dive. And so effectively, if you would extend this out on temperature scale, you would see that number start to come down a little bit. What this slide shows us is that when we began to test these battery systems, we could not predict their performance. And so our predictions, which are shown in the curves, the red and blue curves, deviated significantly from the observed values, which are those black dots. But over time, we were able to predict the performance because we developed this tool. And what the tool does is it allows the data to flow through it in real time, and then it updates the coefficients for the 4 variables that drive performance. And the 4 statistically significant variables that we identified were temperature, power output levels, whether you are charging or discharging, and the state of charge range within which you were operating. And so when you account for that, you can correctly predict the performance of the system. But the point is that as those 4 variables change, the round trip efficiency changes quite significantly as well. We also found this was extremely important for building this into the economic optimization. And when you did so, you actually generated much more value. When we learned that lesson, we moved on to develop an advanced control system testing process called OPET, or the Optimization Performance Evaluation Tool. And effectively what we can do is effectively serve as a Monday morning quarterback. You operate the energy storage system for 1 month, and then we will simulate operation for 1 month and show the value that you achieved and the value that could have been achieved if you had better prediction capacity with respect to prices and load, and a more advanced understanding of your operational capabilities of the system, and we removed any errors in logic. So we found some utilities bidding in for arbitrage, thinking they were getting a 90% round trip efficiency when they were really only getting, say, a 70% round trip efficiency, and therefore actually generating negative economic value. We found another utility that was balancing their system to avoid a 10% penalty, but they were experiencing 20 to 30% round trip efficiency losses to avoid a 10% penalty. And so they were also losing money as they were performing this operation. And so sometimes there were errors in logic, sometimes a lack of understanding of the performance of the system, and sometimes an inability to accurately predict prices. So we were able to shed a fair amount of light, I think, when we've tested this system out on a couple of utilities thus far. So siting of sizing of energy storage is exceptionally important. Ray touched on this point already, and he was correct in doing so. The benefit streams will vary fairly significantly from one location to the next, and they're highly variable. It is important to evaluate a broad set of use cases, but you have to co-optimize and account for imperfect foresight. So it's very complex process. We are now including degradation in our calculations. That's also exceptionally important as well. We have, but typically a smaller that will actually generate economic value in real time. So let's say it's 3 to 5 as opposed to 8 or 10 that you might attempt to model. The value from one region to the next, and even between one utility. So in the Pacific Northwest, if you're a vertically integrated investor-owned utility and you're operating using your own assets, the value of energy storage will vary quite significantly from another that's participating in the Western Energy Imbalance Market, or when compared to a local public utility district or a co-op that effectively relies on the Bonneville Power Administration to meet energy needs. And then it's exceptionally important to build your characteristics, including its energy and power capacities, its charging and discharging efficiencies, and if at all possible, like we do now, variable round trip efficiency that changes based on your use of the system and the use case that you're following. Degradation is a component as well. I want to acknowledge Dr. Imre Zsuk, the lead of the DOE Energy Storage Program, and Bob Kirchmeyer, who's the head of the CEF Modernization Program. And then finally, here's my email if you want to follow up for more information. And you can find our publications at energystorage.pnn.gov, out at the energy storage site that is managed as well. So if you go to obtain RAISE applications, you'll see ours there as well. So, and with that, I guess I'll open it up for questions. Molly?
So I haven't seen any questions on this panel. I found it very, very informative. So thank you very much. We are right at 2 o'clock. So unless anybody wants to raise a hand or pop into the Q&A, I think we will call it a day. Thank you so much to Ray and Patrick. We really appreciate the presentations. We will do this again next week. Hopefully we'll be on time, but do keep an eye on your emails in case we need to push things back because of the administrative meeting. In the meantime, if anybody has any questions, concerns, please email me, and the presentations will be available on the YouTube channel if anybody wants to watch them again or pass them to any colleagues. So thank you everyone and have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.